When U.S. President Donald Trump started taking aim at Canada's dairy, poultry, and egg industries during the renegotiation of NAFTA, those farmers could feel the hair rise on the back of their necks. Once again, it put Canada's supply management system back in the spotlight, and not necessarily for all the right reasons. There's been a growing chorus of voices inside this country calling for an end to what some call a cartel. Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe for Unpublished Ottawa. I'm Ed Hand. Have you ever wondered why so many border Canadians head to the U.S. on weekends to load up on milk, eggs, and poultry? Simple. It's less expensive than buying domestically. But if Donald Trump has his way, that U.S. milk will start flowing across our border, and that has farmers worried. To break it down, supply management rests equally on three pillars. The first, quota. It's a national agency. It'll set production amounts, then set quotas for each province, and each producer must have a quota. Minimum prices. Supply-managed producers are guaranteed a minimum price for their product. Through provincial marketing boards, farmers will negotiate minimum prices with processors. And high tariffs, the third pillar of supply management, the imposition of high tariffs on foreign imports, a policy that makes these goods too expensive for Canadians, leaving domestic supply as virtually the only option for consumers. Canadian dairy, egg, and poultry producers did give up a bit during trade talks in the TPP, but that was less than a 4% increase. The then federal Conservative government compensated those farmers to the tune of $4.3 billion. The average net worth of a Canadian farm is $2.8 million. The average poultry and dairy farms are worth $5.8 and $3.8 million, respectively, according to StatsCan. A University of Manitoba study found that supply management cost wealthy Canadian families an extra $554 a year on those products. Lower-income families paid $339 more. According to Quebec MP Maxime Bernier, farming families working under supply management are indeed far wealthier than most Canadian families. Average after-tax income of all households in Canada is just over $69,000. By comparison, the average dairy farming household income is almost $148,000, and the number is over $180,000 for poultry farming households. Coming up on the Unpublished Cafe, we'll hear from the many voices directly involved in supply management. Bruce Muirhead's a Ph.D. and Associate Vice President of Research Oversight and Analysis and a Professor of History at the University of Waterloo. As well, Egg Farmers of Canada Chair in Public Policy. And Bruce, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure, thanks.
Now, you've spoken quite a bit in support of supply management. Why do you feel it's the best option for Canadian consumers?
Well, should say, first of all, it's the best option in the sectors in which it operates, which is dairy, eggs, and poultry. But just turning to consumers, consumers are, at least in some of the criticism of supply management, consumers are the forgotten element in all of this. And my research has shown that consumers actually get a good deal through supply-managed commodities. When you compare other sort of like-minded or similar states to ours, like Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Western Europe, and even parts of the United States as well. Say you look at dairy prices for 4 liters of milk, we actually are very, very competitive. And in fact, by comparison with places like New Zealand and some parts of the U.S., our milk is cheaper. So that's a result of supply management, how it operates, how it passes on benefits to consumers as well. And I think a lot of the work that's been done, there hasn't been a lot of work on this, but of the work that's been done on the effect of supply management on consumers, I would say some of that is wrong-headed. Methodologies are incorrect. It almost looks to me like a selective use of data to prove a point rather than to just let the numbers speak for themselves. So milk in Canada, I pay probably for 4 liters, maybe $4.27, at most $4.40 or so for 4 liters of milk. In some parts of the United States, according to U.S. Bureau of Labor statistics that are collected, and you can look online and check these numbers, when they're normalized, when the U.S. data is normalized for 4 liters, a gallon's 3.8 liters, and also the exchange rate is factored in some areas of the U.S., according to U.S. Bureau of Labor statistics, places like New England are paying $5.06 for 4 gallons, or for 4 liters. So the price here is good. In New Zealand, the New Zealanders are the largest cross-border traders of dairy products in the world. They control about 32% of the international market. Their milk prices are much, much higher than ours. In fact, for the rock bottom 4-liter price for New Zealand milk, it's probably about $5, $6.10 for 4 liters. And when you look online at New Zealand newspapers, one of the interesting things they say, because of course they think our system is very, very inefficient. When it's anything but inefficient, it's very, very efficient. They think that it's inefficient because it's, in quotation marks, regulated. In New Zealand newspapers, critics often say things like, even Canadians pay less for their milk than we do. So I think it's a good deal for consumers and it's a good deal for farmers.
When you bring up New Zealand and the difference, so I would imagine a good chunk of that extra cost is going to have to be for shipping, and they don't exactly have the population to do it domestically. So in terms of getting it out, you look at New Zealand's in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, although they are a very, very, they're a low-cost provider. It's a grass-based system, so basically they turn their cows out, and whatever they eat in grass is what they eat. So very, very few, not very many supplements are offered to New Zealand cows. The cows actually produce much, much less than Canadian cows do. They're also much smaller, generally speaking, than Canadian cows. But the New Zealanders are, it's a small population, that's true, but they do have a very, very cheap cost of production system, which we can't compete with given our barns and need for winter forage and that kind of thing. So, but even so, their milk is much more expensive in supermarkets than ours is.
How does a quota system improve expansion or growth in the farm, or does it just protect the status quo?
The status quo is what we want. In a sense, the biggest problem among the commodities that are covered by supply management, I know a lot about eggs and dairy. I don't know so much about poultry. But the biggest problem in the dairy and egg sectors globally is overproduction. So the status quo in Canada, it's not quite status quo. They add quota fairly regularly. I mean, there is this past year, I think there was something like 1 million birds added to Canadian egg quota. So they do respond to population increases. The quota increases also respond to increasing demand by consumers for eggs and for dairy as well. So it's not quite a status quo system, but I argue very, very strongly that the biggest problem that farmers face in every single other part of the world, except for Canada in the dairy and egg sectors, is this notion that we can just produce whatever we want and the world will consume it. That is absolutely not the case. In fact, as I'm sure you know, you've read things about American dairy, for example. They've increased production by about 2% per year, and there is absolutely no market for that dairy. So as a result, they spread it on fields as fertilizer. They dump it in lagoons. They just have to get rid of it. They denature it. They just have to get rid of it because there is no market. So overproduction is the biggest disadvantage that farmers in certain commodities face. And of course, dairy and eggs are commodities, so the price goes up and down according to supply and demand. And sometimes other things like how many 25-year-olds are manipulating prices at the mercantile exchange or the commodities, the futures market in Chicago. Those are the kinds of things that affect price. But even so, overproduction and production controls are absolutely necessary. And in fact, I have a postdoc, and she and I have spent a lot of time in the archives in Ottawa looking at the documents, sort of the precursor to supply management in the 1960s. And probably in 75% of the documents that we've come across, production controls is 2 words that absolutely have to be addressed in the 1960s and the 1950s. And in fact, governments of the day, they're on the hook, as the Americans are now, for subsidy payments to farmers. And we've come across a few memoranda in the documents that basically the governments of the day, doesn't matter whether it was Diefenbaker's Conservatives or Pearson's Liberals, they say we're on the hook this year, say 1962, for a $50 million subsidy payment to dairy farmers, and we simply can't afford it. How are we going to deal with this? And of course, dairy is one sector. You have a number of other sectors that are also coming with their hands out. So overproduction is the bane of farmers' existence. And in a sense, they are their own worst enemies when it comes to overproduction. They can control production, but they don't, because most of the time they tend to adopt a rugged individualist stance, and they don't know what their neighbor's doing, say in the wheat sector or the canola sector or the tomato sector. So they're subject to the ebbs and flows of global trade and sometimes domestic trade. And they also have to deal with fluctuating consumer demand for a commodity. When you have production controls in place, you can't overproduce. And as a result, everybody benefits, both in terms of the resources that aren't used to create an overproduced supply of, say, wheat or some other commodity. So you save resources on that front, and you also save in terms of time, energy, and effort.
Bruce Muirhead joining us on the Unpublished Cafe, Associate Vice President of Research Oversight and Analysis and a Professor of History at the University of Waterloo, as well as the Chair of Public Policy for the Egg Farmers of Canada. And we're talking about supply management. And, you know, Bruce, when you look at all the farmers in Canada, dairy, poultry, eggs only account for about 10%. How do you square with the other farmers in this country that aren't supported by supply management?
To some cases, that's their choice. But also, supply management can't operate in sectors that require an export market. Dairy, total global production, about 7% of total global production in the dairy sector is traded internationally. So it's very, very small. And in the case of eggs, it's about 3% of total global production is traded internationally. So again, if you don't have export markets for dairy and egg production, in a sense, you know, who cares? New Zealand could probably pretty much handle the world's demand for dairy products. And, you know, I would guess the United States could handle it for eggs. Basically, most of the 3% in the egg sector, too, is taken up through Dutch egg exports to Germany and also Turkish egg exports to Iraq. So, you know, other than that, there aren't huge flows of eggs around the world. And there similarly isn't a huge flow of dairy around the world. So the other farmers, you know, that don't have supply managed sectors, in some cases it's because their sectors don't permit that sort of organization to pertain. You have to export wheat. You have to export canola, soybeans as well. We don't have a big enough market domestically to soak up the huge volumes of those commodities that we produce. So they have to be exported. And of course, part of the definition of supply management is import controls and export controls. So we don't import those commodities that are covered by supply management to a great extent, and we don't export. So we're not a problem in the international market in terms of overproduction and too much of any one commodity flowing around the world. But that said, as I say, certain sectors have to export in order to be prosperous, and they understand the dynamics of supply management. So, and they don't want supply management given the strictures it places upon their international behavior.
Bruce, I want to thank you for joining us.
Well, a pleasure. Anytime.
Bruce Muirhead is the Egg Farmers of Canada Chair in Public Policy, as well as Associate VP of Research Oversight and Analysis, along with the Professor of History at University of Waterloo. Now, for some experts, Canada's supply management system is in need of an overhaul. Bruno Leroux is an agricultural economist at Laval University, and he joins us now. And Bruno, from your perspective, has supply management worn out its welcome with consumers?
Well, it's a fact that commodities under supply management are more expensive in Canada than in most countries in the world, and the same goes for our production costs, and it's very much policy-driven. So these commodities tend to be highly protected in most cases. Actually, in all of the cases, we have very restrictive tariff rate quotas that allow a small volume to enter at a very low trade tax, and then any quantity above that level then is taxed at a prohibitive rate. And so the volume that comes in from the rest of the world, even if world prices fall, for example, does not change from year to year. So we don't get to benefit from, say, advances in technology in the rest of the world at lower prices.
From your perspective, does the current system stifle innovation on the family farm?
Well, very much so, because it's producers cannot adjust their output very easily. They have to buy production quotas, and in most cases, the exchanges of quota between producers is allowed, but most exchanges are highly deficient, such that they're, for example, in the case of dairy producers in Quebec, which is the largest dairy producing province, there are many more farmers that are demanders of quota as opposed to sellers. Like, for example, for last month, there were about 8 farmers demanding quotas for one farmer willing to sell quota. So it creates a rationing that is highly inefficient, and because of that, we tend to have smaller farms, especially in eastern Canada and in Quebec and Ontario. Our farms are quite a bit smaller than in Western Canada and also of course, in the United States.
What improvements would you like to see to supply management? It's been around since the 60s, and obviously technology changes, innovation changes, that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem the framework of supply management has changed. How would you like to see it either changed or eliminated?
Well, the elimination is it's a hot political potato. We saw it when Maxime Bernier tried to become leader of the Conservative Party. So he paid very dearly for openly saying that he was going to dismantle supply management programs. So I don't foresee the dismantlement of these programs. What I would like to see, though, is improvement, and I think that one way to improve would be to, first of all, in the case of dairy, where there are minimum quota prices on the exchanges in Ontario, Quebec, and in the Maritimes, to first of all get rid of that, and to also allow interprovincial trading of quota, so that farmers could then expand more easily and benefit from new technologies.
Now, would you say some of these provincial regulations are what's hindering expansion for the dairy industry?
Oh yeah. Essentially, it's impossible for to have interprovincial quota trading. Like, for example, somebody living in Quebec but close to the Ontario border cannot buy quota from, say, a neighbor living on the other side of that border. So it makes for a rather inefficient situation, and for some commodities, for example, like turkey, there are very few farmers. And so the trading then is very inefficient because there are so few farmers in a given province. So it would make sense to open up the trading so that there could be interprovincial trade in quota.
I'm wondering if Canada might be missing out on something here. I was reading something recently that if supply management was either scaled back or eliminated altogether, it would open up the opportunity for obviously more production and then more food processing jobs.
Well, that's true. That's certainly a fact. I think that if we were to change our system, or at least allow farms to produce quite a bit more, their cost of production could go down because they're large economies of size. And the other thing that on the processing side, there are some products that I think could be exported, like fine cheeses, for example. So that's the sort of thing that consumer value. It's very trendy, and at the moment we're not exporting because of our policy. So we're just producing for the domestic market, and I think that that's the sort of thing. If we were to deregulate, we could certainly export quite a bit of those fine cheeses.
Why do you think this issue is such a political football for all political stripes? You know, you mentioned Maxime Bernier. Mm-hmm. He's a conservative. Mm-hmm. They're the free market party, but, you know, and he's talking free market. Nobody else in that party is yet. And the Liberals are backing off. The NDP backs off. The Green backs off. Why is it such a football?
Well, I'd say that it's an industry that is very well organized in terms of lobbying. They're very, very powerful. They have the ear of the provincial politicians and the federal politicians. Rural riding are extremely important, so it's for political parties, you cannot win if you don't win enough rural ridings. So it's over the years they've been able really to get the ear of politicians. So every time that there's heat, they're able to go over the head of the agricultural minister and go to the prime minister's office directly, or at the provincial level to the premier directly, and that's why they've been so successful. It's like there are policies that don't make much sense that for some reason are very hard to change. If we look at the gun laws in the United States, from this side of the border, we're shaking our head when we look at their laws. And there are a lot of Americans that feel the same way, yet it's very, very difficult to change the gun laws in the United States because the NRA is a formidable lobby. So it's pretty much the same sort of thing here. When you have such an effective lobby, it's laws that and policies that don't make much sense from an economic point of view are quite resilient, unfortunately.
Bruno, I want to thank you for joining us.
Well, you're most welcome.
Bruno LeRoy is an agriculture economist at the University of Laval. Politics does play a part in the debate over supply management. Think about it. The Conservatives, the party of the free market, wouldn't touch the issue during the last federal election campaign. Just over a week ago, party leader Andrew Scheer admonished Quebec MP Maxime Bernier for his call to end the practice. Is it because of the political clout of those farmers? Danny LeRoy is an agriculture economist at the University of Lethbridge and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute, and he joins us on the Unpublished Cafe. And Danny, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
What is it about the supply-managed farmer that sends politicians running?
That's a very good question. And as an economist, I can't provide a clear answer to that question, although one suspects that there's something that is motivating these individuals to act the way that they are.
It seems more it's the tail wagging the dog here. When you look at the whole farm industry in general, only 10% are covered by supply management. The others are out to fend for themselves.
That is true, although it's important to bear in mind that among commercial enterprises, supply management is probably greater than 10%. There's an awful lot of farms in this country that are hobby farms and retirement farms that aren't commercial enterprises. So if you take the number of commercial farms in Canada, those earning, let's say, more than $500,000 gross revenues, supply management makes up more than 10% of those.
So do you feel Canadian farmers can compete on the global stage?
We are. They are, right? So if you look at other primary products like cattle or canola, wheat, barley, most of the products that are produced by farmers in Canada are traded competitively around the world. The glaring exception are the supply-managed commodities, raw milk, chicken, turkey, and eggs.
Is this a job issue or a consumer issue from your perspective?
It has never been a consumer issue. When these programs were put in place at the national level, each was justified on the basis of improving and stabilizing prices and gross returns to primary producers.
If any political party had the gumption to eliminate supply management, from your perspective, how would that roll out?
Well, that's a good question for a politician. From the perspective of an economist, I think that there are perhaps a couple of alternatives that have been discussed. Among them is that producers should be compensated for the loss of their production quota, the value of it, and across the supply managed sectors, the value of the quota across dairy producers and poultry producers and egg producers, it's about $35 or $36 billion. And if you take a recent census number that there's about 36 million people living in the country, buying off the quota of the supply managed producers would involve a taxpayer transfer that would be equivalent to $1,000 for every man, woman, and child. So it's a big issue.
Danny LeRoy is an agriculture economist at the University of Lethbridge, joining us today as we talk about supply management in Canada, which is certainly having an impact south of the border, as well as we've been seeing with Donald Trump. And, he's made an awful lot of comments. We know about him blowing up so much. But, when we talk about supply management in Canada and how we're keeping American product out and under NAFTA, I'm wondering if maybe Canadian farmers are missing something here because, those U.S. farmers do get subsidies, which would run counter, would they not?
They do, but here's the thing. The supply management doesn't protect Canadian producers against American competition. It protects Canadian producers against Canadian consumers, right? It's consumers who are paying these import taxes of up to 298% in the case of butter. And if the Canadian consumer was adamant that they did not wish to purchase dairy products produced in the United States, these tariffs wouldn't be necessary, right? All the consumers would pursue their own self-interest and purchase goods in Canada. But it's protecting the producer against Canadians who want to get a bargain, who want access to lower cost milk or lower cost cheese or lower cost eggs. And the fact that many Canadians, when they go across the border, among the things that they bring back, in addition to alcohol and cigarettes and other goods like that, they bring back supply managed goods, which they can buy at lower price across the border. But would you say that the product is comparable? The Canadian product, we'll say dairy, for example, is comparable to the U.S. product, or at least in the mind of the consumer, the person that's bringing it back across the border, it's more fully satisfying their want, whether it's a different product or at a different price or something that they can't acquire in Canada. In the mind of the consumer, this is something that it's their revealed preference. This is what we prefer. What's your prediction on the longevity of supply management from an economist perspective? Well, I don't know. I was born in 1969, and supply management has been in place in this country for most of my lifetime. And unless there's a dramatic change, I can't see the system being phased out, for example, in the same way as it was in Australia, where 18 years ago, on the basis of a producer vote, the producers in Australia decided to phase out the system. They were in favor of it. The contrast in Canada is that the producers in this country are very much in favor of maintaining the status quo.
Danny, I want to thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Danny LeRoy is an agriculture economist at the University of Lethbridge. We've heard a number of perspectives on supply management, but we have yet to hear from the front lines. Bruce Sargent's a dairy farmer in southwestern Ontario in Guelph, and he joins us on the Unpublished Cafe. Bruce, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate the time.
How long have you been farming?
So I'm 27. Grew up on the farm, and my dad is in his 50s, and he's been farming his whole life, and he took over from his dad, who farmed his whole life, and so we can go back almost 7 generations of farming in my family.
7 generations. How large is your herd right now?
Yeah, so we're just a little bit below the national average. We milk about 60 cows. The Canadian average is 70, I mean.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of your quota, what's your quota?
So we have enough quota to milk just about 60 cows. The per quota number is always changing because cows actually make more milk.
Mm-hmm.
So you can make the same amount of quota with less cows because genetics have gotten more efficient, feed has gotten more efficient. So yeah, we have enough quota for about 60 cows. It's the easy way of putting it.
All right. Now you mentioned 7 generations of farmers on that farm, and I'm kind of curious. So that means you've had in your family, you had before supply management and after supply management. Now, obviously, down the line, what did you hear from the generations before you about the world without supply management?
Yeah, so my grandpa would tell us stories about going into town with the old jugs and like loading them up in the truck and going into town and getting to the processor, and the processor just saying, "I don't need your milk today. So dump it or try to sell it to somebody else." And when they were taking it, the price would fluctuate like completely uncontrollably with no reason or rhyme whatsoever. And so part of that, like that was also happening to turkey and egg farmers as well, which is why in the 70s, it was actually a beef farmer who had turned MP in Western Canada that was kind of one of the fathers of writing the Farm Products Marketing Act, which eventually turned into the supply management system that we know today. All of those commodities were very heavily impacted by fluctuation in prices. The grocery stores didn't want to pay the farmer what the market value or what the cost of the milk was. So supply management was brought in to stabilize not only the farmer's income, but also the number of farmers, because there'd be huge fluctuations in the number of operations. And it was hard at the time. A lot of farms had to downsize just to make sure that supply and demand were lined up, but they would never go back to it.
Bruce Sargent is joining us on the Unpublished Cafe. He's a dairy farmer in southwestern Ontario in Guelph, and today we're discussing supply management. And obviously, Bruce has been on the front lines. 7 generations, his family has been farming in Guelph. But the thing I'm kind of wondering about here, Bruce, and your perspective on this, when you look at dairy, you look at poultry, and you look at eggs, that's 10% of the farms in Canada, yet 90% of the other farmers aren't protected. It seems, at this protected by supply management, to me, it seems like a have-not situation.
So I want to make a quick clarification first. My family actually immigrated from Ireland, so we haven't been 7 generations in Canada, but we have been very involved in farming. But I'm happy to address that point. So yes, only 10% of farms in Canada fall under supply management, and that's because these markets are particularly prone to fluctuations in prices. And we can see that around the world when we look at the dairy market. The thing is that grain and milk and beef and milk are marketed very, very differently. Milk is a fresh product that ideally is produced in the area that it's going to be used in, which is why supply management works. A cow, to respond to an increase in demand in milk, a cow has to have a pregnancy. A grain field can be planted, harvested, and processed in the same amount of time that a cow has a pregnancy. And the other tough thing too is that grain can store much longer than milk. And if there's a sudden shock in the market and we need to suddenly make less milk, there's only one way to stop a cow from milking tomorrow, and it's not one that we want to entertain. Mm-hmm. And you know what I mean by that.
Yeah.
So, So it goes back to the price of milk. In the U.S., the price of milk is artificially low because it's traded on the stock market, and the processors look at the value of the stock market, and they go out to the farmer and they go, "Sorry, guys, this is all that I can pay you for your milk." And the farmer has no choice to say, "Okay, I guess I'll take that price and just do my best." And then the processor still is profiting, and the farmer is relying on a subsidy after the fact to try to make up the difference. And so that system's not working. Those farmers don't want that anymore. And they're actually inviting Canadian farmers down to their meetings to explain how our system works and what the benefits of it are.
Let's talk about the quality of the product for a second here. Do you find, or do you believe that, obviously you're very proud of your product, but do you believe Canadian milk is better than American processed milk that might be coming up here?
We do have very strict animal welfare and quality traceability programs in Canada that aren't replicated in the States. There are definitely farms in the States whose quality is probably very similar to ours, but overall, Canada does have higher standards. Somatic cell count is something that our industry is always pushing to decrease. It's the amount of white blood cells, basically white blood cell residue that appears in the milk, and it's a indication of the healthiness of the cow. So we have the lowest somatic cell count regulations in the world in Canada. And so we're very proud of that. And we're very proud of our record with animal welfare. ProAction is the program that we have, and the traceability program is called the Canadian Quality Milk Program. And those are both, world leading programs that nobody else has. And the other thing too is that yes, there is some use of the growth hormone in milk production in the U.S. It's not 100% used, but when it boils down to it, what we're looking at right now with Trump has 500,000 liters per day that the U.S. is overproducing because their price is so low. The price goes low. The farmer wants to make the same amount of income. So they increase the amount of milk that they make so that they earn the same by shipping more milk. So that makes 500,000 liters per day that the U.S. is overproducing, and Trump wants to dump that into Canada. And that's what we don't want, because they're overproducing. They're trying to throw tariffs on, our planes because they feel like we're dumping them into the U.S. That was turned down by their trade department, but they want to dump 500,000 liters of milk into Canada on a daily basis. And that would hugely impact not only our farmers, but our processing industry as well. Our processing industry in Canada is over 200,000 jobs in dairy alone. So it's a much more complicated issue than just, some of the labels that we get slapped with sometimes.
All right. Bruce, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the time. I appreciate it.
Bruce Sargent's a dairy farmer in Guelph, Ontario, giving us a firsthand look at supply management. On our next podcast, we'll go over the results and your comments. I want to thank our guest today, Bruce Sargent, a dairy farmer in Guelph. Danny LeRoy is an agriculture economist with the University of Lethbridge. Bruno Leroux, an agriculture economist at the University of Laval. And Bruce Muirhead, Associate Vice President, Research Oversight and Analysis, and Professor of History at the University of Waterloo. He is also the Chair in Public Policy for the Egg Farmers of Canada. I thank you for listening to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand.